Hello everyone, welcome to Santa Pod, the UK's most famous drag strip. I'm here today for Jap Show. Yes, I know. This is a celebration of the Japanese motor car. And I've got my very own stand. You see, my friends Dan and Dan decided to talk me into having my own stand. I was a little bit reluctant at first, but I'm glad that they did because we've got an array of almost 20 fantastic Japanese cars here. Now, I decided to be a little bit cheeky and cheat, and actually just coming past the camera now is one of my dream cars. It's a Mitsubishi 3000 GT. I love these things. However, I have decided to pinch for the weekend something rather iconic. This is Honda UK's very own 2005 NSX, one of the very last of line. This is pretty much the crown jewel in their collection, and I am extraordinarily lucky that they have chosen to lend it to me for the weekend. Now, officially speaking, they've given it to me to bring it down here and for the manufacturer to represent at the show, which I think is very sporting of them because, well, you'd be a bit precious of this if you owned it, wouldn't you? However, I thought that it would be almost criminal to not do a little bit of filming with it, so that's what we're about to do now. I'm going to do another video later on talking through the other cars that are on the stand, but it's actually a pretty good selection here today, and the show hasn't even really started proper. And just behind the camera there's also a beautiful initial D-spec Truno GT Apex as well. But that's not what we're talking about today, we're talking about this. Now, the NSX was introduced in the late 1980s, so this really was a fairly old car by the time it came out. Price when new, about £60,000. Price today, well, there's one of these up for sale with a few less miles than this, but the same colour, same age, for 105 grand. And that's got me begging the question, with the fact that every time you mention the NSX, people start frothing at the mouth about Senna and how wonderful it was and how it, gave Ferrari a right bloody nose. Is it possible that these have actually become overrated? I mean, there is only so much that a car designed in the 1980s can actually do. How good could it possibly be? Well, until now I've not been able to find out. And I have driven this, and you're going to see that very shortly. But first, let me talk you through the car. Now, it's a proper sports car design and actually was very ahead of its time. In fact, even in 2005, this is still a reasonably advanced car. It was all aluminium, and it's got double wishbone suspension, front and rear, which in my mind is the correct kind of suspension for a car like this. Now, this car has a mid-mounted, transversely orientated 3.2 litre V6. The early cars had a 3 litre engine with a 5-speed box or an optional automatic, and a depressingly large number of these, especially if you go on the import websites, are auto, and I just cannot imagine this car with an auto box in it. You could also have a Targa top version, but the coupe is pretty sexy. Now, this engine bay is immaculate. Look at that. Honda kind of went to town. I wish I could claim that this is all me and that I've spent, the whole weekend getting this thing looking pristine, but actually the weather up until now has been utterly atrocious, so I'm glad that it's sunny enough today for us to give you a proper walk around. Now, this colour, which is called Imola Orange, is actually suits this very well. The earlier cars seem to look a little bit better in red with the black roofs. The easiest way to tell them apart is the fact that this has lost the pop-ups. In 2002, the pop-ups went and replaced by the fixed headlights, but otherwise they're kind of the same. Nothing really that major changed beyond the engine. The thing about the NSX, and I must confess, and this is a bit controversial, I know, I'm not actually a huge fan of the car or the way it looks, because it's got these odd proportions. It's really narrow and really long, and it looks kind of tall. Now, if you take this car's probably most famous rival, which would be the Ferrari 355, this is just a little bit narrower. It's exactly the same height to about a mil, but it's that much longer. It's big at the back here, you see, and there is actually a useful storage space here, which I shall show you because, well, it's bigger than you think. I mean, you'd hope it would be big, but I do know a few cars where you open up and you go, oh, where has the space gone? But look at this. I've got my bag in there, I've got camera kit, I've got a jacket, I've got bottles of water. You could easily go touring in this car. And it is actually very comfortable as well. It's even pretty good on fuel. I haven't done the maths, but the other day I did about 211 miles to about 35 litres of fuel, so I'm going to put the actual economy on screen now. The interior of this car is actually pretty trick as well, but before we show you that, I just want to show you this lovely rear end. It's pretty spectacular with this whole full width rear light, and that's possibly one of the most iconic views of the NSX. Got twin exit exhaust, and this car, as you might imagine, being a Honda heritage item, is pretty much bone stock. Let's show you the inside. This is, if I'm being kind to it, what I'd call upmarket 1990s JDM. You have this classic mixture of some pretty nice feeling leather, along with some less nice feeling leather and classic black plastic. It smells like a 1990s Japanese car in here, and you've got toggle switches and buttons and things hidden everywhere. A couple of things that I don't like are the weird looking gear knob. Here I prefer the metal item that I think they might have done on the Type R or the NSX-R. And when you talk about car prices, NSX-Rs now, I've seen some go for over £200,000. There's also a couple of blank switches here, and I really don't know why. I mean, what could possibly have gone in there? The cubby holes down here are also completely useless. They are so ridiculously small. What's going to go in there? Nothing. Same thing with the glove box. You think it's going to be a decent size. It's not. The weirdest switch as well is over here. It says main on. Took me ages to work out what that means. It's actually a safety lock for the passenger's window. I mean, what's the point in that? But the view out from here is pretty good. And I can't work out, maybe you guys can tell me what you think, whether the back of these dials is just a different shade of black to the rest of the car, or it's actually a very dark blue. I think it might be dark blue, but I'm not sure. Now, what you might also want to see is what's up the front, because you'd imagine that there might be a little bit of storage space up there as well, because there would have been in the equivalent Ferrari. Not here. You have a collapsible spare wheel, which of course is thoroughly useless. Old Porsches did the same thing as well. Very clever way of getting a spare wheel in a car, but if you have to use it, where in the hell do you put the full-size one that you've just taken off? I know you've got all the ABS gubbins and whatnot in here, but in reality, there is basically nothing to see here. Now, the truth of it is that I don't really need to like the way that this car looks at all. And I can't really complain about the price too much either, because the market sets that. Honda haven't told people what one of these is worth for about 15 years. But fast Hondas aren't made by their on-paper specs or their 0 to 60 times or anything like that. They are made purely and simply on the driving experience. And that is where this legendary car really has high expectations set for it. Is it that good? Let's find out. So how does one go about judging one of the most legendary driver's cars of all time? It's certainly not an easy task. Now, for full disclosure, my frame of reference for this kind of car would probably be something like a Lotus Esprit, of which I've driven a couple that were produced at the same time as the NSX. I've driven a few 911s of the period as well, and of course the Ferrari 355 and 360, and those are probably the main cars that people think about when they're considering the NSX. With any vehicle this legendary, you of course have preconceptions about what it's going to be like, and mine were as follows. I didn't think that the car would make very much noise, knowing that this would be a bone stock example, or as close to stock as it could possibly be. I thought that the steering and gearbox would be excellent, and I didn't really think that it'd be that fast, and I thought that the engine would probably be somewhat gutless in the lower half of the rev range. As it turns out, this car, well, was quite different to what I expected. That engine, although you do really need to rev it out to its 8,000 RPM redline to get the best from it, actually has plenty of go from low down. If you're not expecting sort of modern turbocharged torque from it, it's actually a real delight. Maybe the biggest surprise is the amount of noise in the cabin. Now, this car is not only one of the early applications of VTEC, although by the time this particular example was produced, it was a very common system. It also had a form of variable length intake manifold. Now, the second of those opens up at about 4,800 RPM, and you get the most wonderful induction roar in the cabin. Gonna do my best to give you as much of that as I can, but honestly, from the outside, this car doesn't sound all that. At least, I don't think so. I've not actually heard it going past. I've just driven it with the window down, and that doesn't really do all that much. What you do get, though, is just this real mechanical noise in here. You can hear the engine whirring away and doing its thing, and no, it doesn't sing like a Ferrari V8 does, but it has a tune all of its own, and the best part is that it is all real, genuine sound, and it is music to my ears. The pedals are placed pretty close together, as you would expect them to be, and that makes heel and toeing in this thing an absolute delight. Now, I'll confess, I'm going to be exercising a large degree of caution while driving this car. As you can probably see, the roads in places are still somewhat damp from earlier rains, and I have absolutely no intention of returning Honda's prized possession on the back of a recovery truck. That would be bad form. The electric steering in this car apparently disables itself over about 30 miles an hour, but there are differences in the steering rack between this and a manual example. Unfortunately, my research would indicate that no car produced after about 1995, with one or two very small exceptions, had a manual rack. And as I've got no other experience in the world of the NSX, I couldn't tell you whether this is decidedly better or worse than those. Now, at low speeds, you can certainly feel that electric assistance because the steering becomes unnervingly light when you're parking the car. And I believe that is basically why Honda introduced the system. People were complaining about how difficult the car was to maneuver when they're in town and, putting it in car parks and whatnot. Now, the only other example of an NSX that Honda UK have is actually a pre-production car and is the oldest surviving official UK NSX. Unfortunately, it is saddled with an early auto gearbox, and I just cannot see one of these being any fun whatsoever with that box. I suppose the good news is that if for whatever reason you physically cannot drive a manual, and this is your dream supercar, you can have one without having to butcher it. Out of curiosity, I looked at a couple of Japanese auction sites for NSXs, and I was shocked at just how many were automatics. Now, I couldn't say whether that tells me that many originally sold were automatics, or the fact that the manuals have just all been snapped up and are mostly hidden away in collections now. Really couldn't say. But I did find it quite surprising. I really would have thought that for a car like this, the auto would have been a very unusual option box to tick. How wrong I was. Other things I learned when I was doing a bit of research on this car include the fact that this car's body shell was actually 50% stiffer than the equivalent 911 of the time. Now, what they consider to be an equivalent 911, I don't know, but that is still very impressive. In fact, even through the lens of my 2019 eyes, and let's be fair to it, in real terms, this is pretty much a 30-odd-year-old design. It rides quite well. It's actually a lot stiffer than I expected it to be. I was thinking it was going to be quite soft and quite compliant, and although it is the latter, it's certainly not the former, and that does give you a little bit more confidence when pushing on. Unfortunately, the steering isn't actually quite as pinpoint accurate as I expected it to be, and that really is a surprise. Now let's give you a little sample of that V6 noise I was talking about. The car is geared relatively long. Second is essentially good enough to reach the speed limit on this road, so you do have to be a little bit careful. It actually makes it a quicker car than you think. You're working through the gears and you realise that you are carrying quite some speed. Now, the steering does actually pick up some weight when you're in a corner like that. Oh, and I can feel it dancing around a little bit. I have been warned that these cars are not quite as friendly on the limit as you might think, and I've got, honestly, no intention whatsoever of approaching it. Now, at this kind of speed, the steering does give you a little bit of texture through the wheel, but it seems very mixed in its responses. Sometimes it talks to you and sometimes it just doesn't. It is, unfortunately, a real weak point in this car. I've no doubt there are plenty of people out there sharpening all sorts of garden tools ready to skewer me and tell me how wrong I am about the greatest driver's car that ever was, and the fact that, you know, how can I know more about the car than Senna? Well, Senna's involvement, I think, is often a little bit overplayed. He certainly talked to the engineers a little bit about the car, but he certainly wasn't there from day one. And I think really it's the engineers at Honda that should take a lot more credit for putting together such an astonishing and historically important car. What also amazes when you get in this thing is just how it feels. I, as I'm sure you have seen so many NSXs, and you're aware that it has this big fighter jet inspired glass cockpit, which is all wonderful, but it's only when you actually drop down into one, you move out onto the road, do you realise quite how special this thing feels. It's ridiculously airy in here, and I've got acreage in front of me. It's quite wonderful. It does feel like the other side of the car is miles away, although in truth this is actually a pretty narrow vehicle. You look over here and you're like, actually I can touch the passenger side window without much effort at all. Your visibility for at least the front half of the car is brilliant. You can see over your shoulder quite easily because the B pillar is quite far back. There is no C pillar in here, and rear visibility is not too bad either. Your rear view is sort of bisected by this nice Imola orange wing, but this is actually a really easy car to drive. You do have to remember the fact that it is actually quite long, but it's also very easy to place. Another design feature that you only really appreciate when you're actually sat in the car and on the move is the bonnet. For whatever reason, I always thought that the bonnet on an NSX was actually quite flat. It's not in the least. It's actually got some very well-defined haunches, and it really does remind me of my old Lotus Evora. I've seen quite a few people draw comparisons between the NSX and the Evora, and I can kind of understand why. They're both aluminium chassis, mid-mounted transverse V6 powered cars which are famed for their handling and reasonably lightweight without, you know, too big a power figures, and they have manual gearboxes available to them, and I can kind of see why people would sort of compare them. In truth, it's a very unfair thing to do because they are, well, worlds apart. The Evora, for my money, is a better car. It's more modern, it handles much better, the gearbox is better, it's faster, it makes a better noise and all that jazz, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But I knew people would want me to, because the comparison seems to keep being drawn, and now I'm glad to say that I can actually compare an NSX with an Evora 400, something I genuinely thought would probably never happen. When I got in this car earlier today, it was absolutely chucking it down, and it was, well, not the conditions that I had in mind. Bit of love there from a Civic Type R owner. As I was saying, when I picked the car up earlier today, it was heaving it down, and the conditions were not what I'd really hoped for my first drive of this wonderful, legendary car. It does get quite a few stares, but fortunately, it's a very easy car to drive. It's not at all intimidating, and for doing the kind of boring slog that was required to get me from Honda UK to home, it's actually been a very good companion. One real similarity between this and the Evora is the trick that the car plays on you because of the way that it's been designed. You do initially feel like you're sat actually a little bit high in this. The truth is that you're not. It's just the fact that that nose is so low to the ground that even though you're sat pretty low down, you still feel high up. Now, the 6-speed box in this is not quite as brilliant as some of Honda's modern boxes. As an example, the one in the FK8 is better. However, when the age of the car is taken into consideration, it's very good indeed, and it certainly doesn't hinder your progress. For that more boring motorway stuff, it's actually quite well geared. You're doing less than 3,000 RPM at motorway speeds, which means, unlike a old school Civic, the car isn't buzzing its head off when you're trying to make just normal progress. Having sampled those contemporary Ferraris, I do now thoroughly understand the impact that this must have had on them when the NSX came out. This does really feel like a car which has a bit of a mass-produced quality about it, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. I mean that as in a everything's nice and it works and it feels solid and it goes together, and nothing in here is rattling or shaking. It's amazing. This is a Honda. You kind of know that it will go pretty much forever if you look after it. I'm sure these aren't perfect cars, because in reality few things are. But it is an absolute joy to drive. You see, this is a real supercar. My Evora, simply as a result of the time that it came out, was sort of a almost supercar. This thing, in the mid-90s, I want to say was a full-on card-carrying supercar. It had the same power as a Ferrari 348. Near enough. I mean, the 348 allegedly had a little bit more, but they were Italian horses that we're talking about, and I think Japanese horses tend to be a little bit bigger, especially when we're looking at 90s car figures. The NSX's greatest trait becomes clear after you spend just a little bit of time threading it down your favourite B road. And I know this might sound a little bit odd when I'm talking about one of the greatest supercars of all times, one of the most important cars in the last 3 decades, and arguably the most famous JDM car of all. What happens is you just start to forget the car. You see, it does what any truly brilliant driver's car should. It just does everything you tell it to, and you don't think about what you're in, you just think about you and the road and your destination, if you even have one. And this is exactly the kind of car in which I'm quite happy to go driving without any idea about where I'm going to end up. It's sized perfectly that I'm not really that worried about oncoming traffic down narrow roads, and it's not got too much power that I'm going to be worried about putting my foot down, but it's got enough that I know I can have a bit of fun when I find a decent road. The view you have out the front is dominated by the road and not the car. It's a wonderful place to do the business of driving from. Everything in here has been calibrated to just give me driving joy. I'm never going to own an NSX. Certainly not an old one. The new ones greatly interest me, but I still haven't driven one. Hopefully that'll be able to happen soon, but we shall see. The looks of this older car, although it's growing on me, just don't sit quite right, and they are at a price point that I just can't get on with. However, in a world where people will pay just as much for an old Ford as they will a new Aston Martin, I certainly can't place blame at Honda's feet for the values of these cars going up. After all, they only do that because they're a car that people really, really want. And unlike some other iconic cars that I've driven in the past, if you're in the position where you've spent your entire life lusting after having one of these, and you've finally found yourself able to pull the trigger and buy this brilliant car, you're not going to be disappointed. It is what everybody's ever told you. And I now am very happy to place the NSX in a list of cars that I don't necessarily love, but I thoroughly and completely respect. Honda engineers, I tip my hat to you. You pulled off something quite remarkable with this car. Thank you all for watching. I would love this car to reappear on the channel at some point in the future, hopefully with some better conditions, and the best way to make that happen is for you to share this video with all your friends, get plenty of views, because you know, the guys at Honda, they're realistic. If they can see that the effort that they've put in, and I thank them again for lending the car to me, is being rewarded, then I'm sure we can make some magic things happen. And they do also have some other very cool stuff hidden away in their toy shed, so please do share the heck out of this, and I will keep the content coming. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. It's been a pleasure. Hit the like button, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already. See you for the next one. Bye bye.